What is up, YouTube people? Eric here with Team Badman, welcoming you guys finally after what feels like such a long time to an actual match on the channel. Now, I know it's been a really long time, and I apologize about that, but matches take a really long time to edit, and with work and traveling for all of these events, it's been insanely busy. And I've really been trying to get them up, but I've been failing, so I really apologize. But this is a match to most definitely make it up to you guys. As you guys know, I have been traveling for some regionals recently, and I most recently traveled to the Michigan regional to do some judging there, and I was able to get some match footage. So I'm going to bring you guys the first match of those that I've got, which is the top 8 match between Red Ruthless Broly and Red Enraged Yamcha. Now, this was a seriously fun match to watch. Seeing a Yamcha that wasn't orange adaptive actually make it to the top cut of the event was really exciting. And as well, I know the player who was playing Red Ruthless Broly, Eric Jennings, who actually got his invite at this event, and he's a very talented player. It was a really big success, and this match was just a lot of fun. I think you guys will see where that all comes into play at. So we're gonna go ahead and get things rolling. As you guys can see here, we've actually got a little bit of a different layout. It's a little more detailed. I've got power stages on here, and anger, and the deck count. I tried to make it a little bit more elaborate so that it's easier to track along with, but hopefully it's not too overwhelming. If it is, let me know down in the comments section. So we're gonna go ahead and get started with the match. So Yamcha opens up after winning the dice roll. Doesn't like the hand that he sees, so he passes and rejuvenates a red tandem blast, which makes sense for Red Enraged Yamcha, because you're going to want to shut off those non-styled cards and utilize some of those energies. Broly follows up with a red relaxation for the first turn, which is going to be an absolutely great call. So he decides to drop the red stop, and he doesn't rejuvenate because he wants to utilize that and draw it later for the relaxation. And lo and behold, following right up, Yamcha does the exact same thing. But the downside is here, he's going to get Focused Assault, which isn't quite as good of a draw. It's not really going to help him, considering that Yamcha's not really going to want to level with Anger here as much as you would expect, Unleashed or effects like that. So he's just going to lay it out and pass. And it goes over to Broly's turn. He draws yet another red relaxation. So he's sitting on 2 relaxation at the moment. Really pretty spot to be at. And that's something that you want to see early games. That way you can go in with as strong a combat as possible, especially if you're Broly, because you just want to maximize those combats, get the extra draws, hit hard. So he decides to drop a red stop and a red static shot, which static shot would be what he would get back if he used both relaxations. And it's going to be really useful here. So Yamcha pulls a Visiting the Past, which it doesn't look so good for his discard pile at the moment. He's got that Focused Assault in there. He's got Sacrifice and a Red Energy defensive stance. So if Broly does pull some energy attacks, he'll actually be able to fend that off. But that's not really the focus of what Ruthless Broly wants to do. As we all know, Ruthless Broly likes to punch things with his fists very hard, and it was actually unusual for me to see a red static shot on the end of Eric with Red Ruthless Broly, though red static shot is a really good call in this deck, since a lot of the attacks are going to be styled and hit for large amounts of damage, so shutting off endurance on those is going to be a really big key. So Eric decides to enter here, and he starts off with the first relaxation. He gets back the stop, which is going to be useful. He can use it to block Yamcha's power, or maybe Yamcha's got a red static shot or something like that. And you can see him debating here on whether he wants to utilize the second one, because having an extra card in hand, that would be 6 cards, and he decides to go for it, which this could be a really good call on Yamcha's part, knowing that he could just Visiting the Past and grab an energy block for it. But there's still going to be that unendurable part. Broly finishes things off by banishing the remaining card, Red Stop, in his discard pile for the Mastery, so he deals extra damage. And then it goes over to Yamcha to get all of his starting stuff, so he's going to proc the relaxation, actually get Anger off of it, and then he decides to Visiting the Past as well for the Red Energy defensive stance. A pretty good call here, considering that he knows Broly has that red static shot in hand, and that could do a really considerable amount of damage throughout the turn. Especially if there's a bunch of other styled cards in hand, in which we see one of those right here. Broly leads off with red double strike, one of the most common physicals that you'll find in any red deck, but it's especially dangerous for Broly because you get a considerable amount of modifiers on that just base AT damage. So he decides to swing here with the first double strike, Net and Anger, and it hits for 6 stages, lowers the anger that Yamcha gained off of the red relaxation. That's actually going to play a relatively big part here later on. It's just going to be that slowly stacking up damage. So Yamcha decides to open with his power, which is a pretty good call seeing that double strike is already on the board. He knows if it hits, he'll be able to stop that, or he'll stop another physical attack. And the issue is that red doesn't really have a whole lot of attacks that say this attack's unstoppable. And in this case, Eric decides to take it, so he's just going to go ahead and take the damage off of it, banish his own red energy defensive stance, and so automatically his next physical is going to be stopped. So puts him in a little bit of a spot. He's automatically going to lose out on one of the physicals in his hand there. He knows the energy in his hand is probably going to get blocked anyway. And it gives a little bit of momentum to Yamcha here so he can kind of figure out something that he wants to do. This is the part of the game where it's at least relatively slow. There was a lot of kind of deciding about what they were going to do. It took a little while. As you see, it took a little bit there, but Broly decided to go for the other shot of double strike, gain his anger back, and it's automatically stopped by Yamcha's power. So it wasn't going to do a huge amount of damage. It was going to do 6 stages, which is very, very reasonable. And that's something that it's good for Yamcha that he was able to wick off. Sure, it wasn't a stronger attack, but it's still less damage that he's going to be taking. And given what all is in his hand, as you'll see throughout the remainder of the turn, it makes sense. So Yamcha decides to throw the Focus Assault that he drew with the relaxation. It's not super strong. It's going to be for 4. He's got nothing attached that he can pop off. But it's going to be an extra attack that goes through. And the big thing to note here is that Broly hit 2 red trailing blasts here, which if he is playing an Unleashed build, that's really going to slow him down because it's 2 less cards that he's going to be able to attach. And it may make it actually difficult for him to kind of get that momentum to reach the higher levels where he wants to reach. So Broly's kind of waiting out here. He's got multiple different choices in hand, and there's still a considerable amount in both players' hands. And that goes to play right here when Broly follows up with Red Tandem Attack. And he gets the immediate effect off of it, if your opponent has 5 more cards in his hand, which is a really, really good thing for him. You want to get those extra card draws. You want to be able to, shift the momentum as much as possible. And I think this was a good way to kind of get around that loss of an attack from Yamcha's power. So he hits with it, hits for 9 stages and deals critical damage, which, of course, if this were enraged, he'd get an extra anger off of it, but nothing doing here. So Yamcha follows up with an Expert Assistance played from the hand. Now this could be really troublesome for Broly, considering that he wants to just keep going, and Expert Assistance forces those immediate passes, which can really slow him down, especially with so many cards currently sitting in his hand. But the same is also true for Yamcha, who's still sitting on 4 cards in his hand as well. His power's already been used, and Broly hasn't used the Master yet, so that's a possibility. He could get back the Tandem Attack, but he decides to go for a Sword Stab here. He gains that extra anger, so he's at 3, which puts him in a pretty good spot to level up. Yamcha manages to block it with a catch, but since he's got no anger, there's nothing he can do with it. He can't really banish anything. But the most logical play here for Yamcha is to follow up with the Expert Assistance. And that's exactly what he decides to do. So it gives him 2 extra turns of buffer to work with. And this was a really, really big turn for Yamcha here. So it helped him out, and he drew a wall breaker with it. So that's going to slow down any of Broly's leveling momentum. It only hits for 1 stage, which is hardly great. But with the second pass, he plays another Expert Assistance, drawing into 2 Expert Assistances on a combat. Really hurt Yamcha, but at the same time, since he knew he was going to take damage, he was able to get it back relatively nicely. And it could have been a really solid momentum shift as long as he's got the blocks and the way to kind of wick off the damage. So Broly follows up with Aerial Assault. He can utilize the Mastery with this. And Yamcha does have another block in hand. He's got that extra catch. Of course, he still can't do any banishing with it, but it gives him enough momentum to work with so he can proc the second Expert Assistance And from the look on his face, he doesn't really draw into anything that's too useful. He does appear to have attack. He doesn't have stages to work with. There's nothing that he can really do here. So he decides to pass on it. And since Broly entered, he has to discard down first, which, based on what he discards, could have been a really, really solid combat. Of course, he still had the static shot in his hand. Ultimately, it's going to be what he decides to keep in hand that can really help move Broly throughout the remainder of the game. You can see him deciding here. He's got a little bit challenging of a time, deciding what he wants to do. So he decides to drop the static shot, and he drops a stop, which was, of course, what he drew with the relaxation. Yamcha decides to drop Tandem Blast, which Tandem Blast could have been useful depending on what was drawn by Broly, but it doesn't seem to have done very much, especially considering he couldn't even throw it. So it does go over to Yamcha's turn. Draws nothing super useful, but he does get that ball 4. He decides to rejuvenate it, and he rejuvenates Enraged Blast as well. So it pops over to Broly's turn, and Broly draws into his 3, and he's like, this looks kind of interesting here. This actually was a little more favorable on my end, since that was the side of the table that I was actually sitting on, so I was a little bit more aware of what Eric had in his hand. Decides to flip over the turn counter to that awesome Ghost Rider Yusuke from the Yu Yu Hakusho card game. If you guys haven't played it, I definitely recommend trying it out sometime, even though it's relatively old. But Broly decides to enter combat, and naturally he's going to get that mastery off as best as possible. And Yamcha's going to draw into his 3, and he decides to open with a stare down, which is a pretty good draw, except there was a sphere in the hand of Yamcha, so he's, that's an extra benefit for Yamcha. He wants those cards back as much as possible. He can't always rely on endurance to wick off the damage, especially if Broly gets to 4, where it's going to do no good. So he follows up with Trailing Blast, which is going to be really good, especially if Yamcha utilizes Unleashed. He wants to attach those so that way he can just gain as many actions as possible into combat. The Trailing Blast goes through, and Broly is kind of bummed out because he sees that red forward stance drill on the top, so he can't utilize the mastery with it. There's nothing he can really do there. But with still 3 cards in hand and a remaining action from Broly, he's still got the ability to do a little bit of work here. And he decides to follow up with a Red Collision, which is going to do a very reasonable amount of damage if it hits. Of course, he can't gain anger from it because the wall breaker's attached. But if it hits, it'll hit for 9 stages. I can do a very, very sizable amount, considering that Yamcha doesn't have a lot of stage to work with after taking a beating in the previous combat. He manages to gain a little bit of it back here with a blocking hand, which, as we know, is one of Red's best blocks. He gets some of those extra stages back. He gains a little bit of anger, so that's something he's going to want to work with. And Yamcha follows up with his MP power, so he decides, Broly decides, I'm just going to go ahead and take it. Maybe he didn't have a block in hand, maybe he decided to let it hit. But on top of his discard pile, we see that coveted Red Double Strike, which is going to be a really, really big deal here. He can always decide to Mastery, which is exactly what he does. He's still got that static shot. And he's going to decide to Mastery it away for the Double Strike. I did misspeak earlier. I thought he discarded the Red Static Shot. Instead, he discarded Broly's Face Crusher. Perhaps a better call, but either way, it still went back into the deck. And he decides to throw the Double Strike here. It's going to go for 6 stages if it hits, but Yamcha's power, of course, automatically stops it. And so Yamcha decides that he's going to pass, nothing else he can do here, and so the second hit of Red Double Strike is going to go off, and he's going to swing for it. They take a moment here to calculate out the damage based on the stages, so it's just a little bit of figuring out here, a little bit of confusion and some fast-paced action. I think we've all had it happen to us before. But everything did get all sorted out. Instead, you can see here that he loses a Trailing Blast. Yamcha loses 1. And he decides not to banish it from the Endurance. Instead, lucks into a Red Energy Defensive Stance to go ahead and banish to wick off some of the damage, which works really favorably. This leaves Broly with 1 card in hand. Depending on what that is, could change up the game. Yamcha's also sitting on 1 card in hand, so it does kind of change where things go. This is probably the most pivotal moment of the game right here. So Broly decides to go ahead and look through the discard pile, obviously looking for, whatever blocks he may be able to find, considering if his opponent, may have another sphere, if he has an event in his hand, or, if he's got an extra block. And he decides to go for the Unleashed. As expected out of Ruthless Broly, he decides that he just wants to level, and in this case, that wall breaker that's attached to him is going to be a really, really big deal, because that's an extra level for him right there. Searching through his life deck, he decides that he's going to grab Red Inferno, which is going to be a really good choice here. Broly's going to deal a lot of critical damage and get that extra effect. So he's going to use the Unleashed, and he's going to go on ahead to 3, which is going to be a huge, huge deal, considering that he wasn't really going to be doing it by anger at the moment unless he could wick off that wall breaker. In this case, having it doesn't really matter, because it doesn't matter whether Broly is on level 3 or level 4. Either way, he's going to be punishing for a considerable amount of damage. At this point, it did raise the question why Unleashed is not banished after use, but that's a story for another time. And instead, Broly follows up with his physical for 7, and he ends up getting off the critical damage, so wall breaker goes away. The Yamcha player accidentally forgets that wall breaker isn't banished after use, instead of discarded. So that does get clarified here briefly after he does draw, but it didn't really change any course of the game because no cards had been discarded, nothing has been played, so it all gets straightened out and we're all set to go. So Yamcha draws in, places a Red Blaze, which at this point in the game could be extremely helpful for him. It's 2 anger, he gets to rejuvenate 2, which is one thing that Red doesn't really have a lot of unless you're playing cooler, of course, so that's going to be a huge, huge benefit for him. So Broly goes back to his turn, and in typical Broly fashion, he analyzes the hand. It's like, maybe I should just go in and hit things, because I like to hit things a lot. And he keeps looking at his hand. It seems to be a little bit of a theme with this game. Most players are very analytical about their hands. And that is a part of the way that Eric plays. Eric's a very thought-driven player, kind of analyzing all the situations. A little bit of playful banter here. It was actually a lot of fun. A lot of jokes were thrown about during this match, and it's something that I really, really enjoyed seeing. So after analyzing everything on the board, Broly decides, why not? I'm just going to go ahead and enter combat here. But the downside to him here is that he's got that Unleashed on the top of the discard pile, so there's not really very much that he's going to do. He doesn't get that extra +2 stage buff. For his power, it wasn't going to do a whole lot, but with plenty of extra physical attacks in there, with the double strike that we already noted, cards like Tandem Attack and Collision, he can still swing for a very, very considerable amount of damage. The thing he's doing here is deciding if he actually wants to use the Mastery effect so he can just get rid of Unleashed, which he decides to do. Of course, he's not going to get the buff, but he gets the red double strike that's underneath it, which is exactly what he wanted to set up. And in this case, that sets him up really, really pretty. That with Yamcha on level 1, it's going to swing for 9 stages of damage, which is a really, really considerable amount for an attack that only has 80 stages. So I would see it doing a very, very considerable amount of damage here. In this case, he's debating on whether he wants to throw it. Instead, he decides to master whatever card that was and get out that double strike, gains the extra anger, and so he's going to go ahead and go for 9. You can see Yamcha here considering, do I want to take it? Do I want to take this attack for a decent amount of damage? He's already down the life card count, and depending on what's in his hand, it may be unnecessary damage, but he decides to take it. Takes the extra damage, gets a little bit of endurance there, and you can see the Yamcha's rescue that he got, which is an absolute save here for him. That allows him to escape what could have been a really, really dangerous combat, considering that there was still another attack on the board for 9, and Broly's power for 7, plus whatever may have been sitting in his hand. There's a lot of damage can be dealt out, and actually could have been a game ender based on what was in Yamcha's hand. You can see him sitting there kind of deciding, what do I want to drop? What do I want to drop here? It's a little bit of a tough call depending on what you've got, on what you really want to utilize. It looks like there's a red sourceful block in his hand there, which of course, if that is it, he could have blocked the physical that came through, but he decided to take a really, really big chance on hitting, and it actually paid off for him in escaping this combat. So Broly decides to discard a red Shattering Leap, which could have been the absolute end of the game right there. Sure, it would have cost a little extra stages, but Broly's still going to throw those for a massive, massive amount of damage. The Yamcha player here decides to drop his third Yamcha's Rescue, which means all three were gone in a single combat. And that's a huge, huge deal for Yamcha, considering that 1, it's an Omni block, and 2, it shuffles itself back into the deck and he can escape combat again. So he draws and drops another Red Blaze, which can really help him get some cards back into the life deck, which he needs at this point, considering he is so far down the life card count. And any physical is going to go through for a massive, massive amount of damage. Proccing off those Blazes would be a huge deal for him to get off those extra cards. So it goes over to Broly's turn, and Broly gets his third red relaxation of the game, which is everything that you want to see in the late game in his case. Whatever may be on the bottom of his discard pile, at that point, it doesn't really matter. If it's styled, he still has the Shattering Leap on top of his discard pile that he can always mastery for. If it's in, an actually viable attack, it's something that he could always throw. And you see both players searching through one another's discard piles, just checking out for everything, wondering, what it might be. If you look at the very bottom of the discard pile here, you'll see a lot of blocks on Yamcha's end that are already gone. A lot of them went away in the early game. But the biggest key here is whatever is on the bottom of Broly's discard pile. So if it's a usable attack, it can be big. And he pulls out a red Double Strike with it, which is exactly the card that he would want in this case. Another, physical that stays on the table. A very, very considerable amount of damage, and he decides to banish the Shattering Leap off the top, and there's a second Double Strike that he can utilize with the Mastery, so that is 5 guaranteed attacks that he's got this turn. The Double Strike from this card, the Double Strike from his hand, and Broly's power. Depending on what he's got in his hand, Broly's power could also give him an extra attack to work with. So after deciding a little bit, just waiting things out and considering the options, but Broly goes for his power, and he reveals Double Strike and a Face Crusher to get that extra card, and that's going to go through for the 7 stages. You see some of that extra useful endurance getting used there, just so that you can wick off some of the damage, but both of them were physical blocks, so he knows for a fact those aren't in Yamcha's hand. Yamcha gets off the Unleashed here, which is desperately, desperately going to help him. He attaches the extra Trailing Blast, shuffles what's left of the meager card count in his life deck, and that gives him the opportunity to advance all the way up to level 3. But the downside here is that once he advances to level 3, those Trailing Blasts go right back to his hand, so he can't use the extra effect of Unleashed and go ahead and pop those off in order to lower Broly down to level 1. But he gains a lot of extra cards in his hand here. He gets those 2 Trailing Blasts back. He draws a card from Yamcha's level 3 power, and then draws and discards for the Mastery. So he's sitting on 7 cards in his hand at this point, which is an absolutely massive amount to have at just about any point. But we already know at this point that 2 of those are Trailing Blasts, so he's going to be relying on those stages. And since he leveled and Broly's on level 3, he's only at 3 stages above 0. Which is going to be capitalized on by Broly as he throws the red heel kick. Now, he's got plenty of anger to work with so that he can get an extra attack card out of the discard pile. And the red Double Strike on top looks really, really tempting. It's one of those things you see and you're like, I might just want to grab this. It's an extra attack in hand. It's going to be 2 attacks on the board. That's super, super useful. It's exactly what I would want. But in Ruthless, since you've got your Mastery, you don't really want to go for it. That's what Broly decides to do here. Instead, he gets Tandem Attack, which is a great call considering that Yamcha has so many cards in his hand. So he'll get the extra draw off of that. He'll gain the extra anger. And this kick is going to go through for a lot of damage. If this kick goes through, it goes through for 12 stages of damage. It's going to be a huge amount. Yamcha utilizes the catch, which of course he's still got no anger, hasn't got that effect off yet, which is a real downer, but it's 1 extra attack stopped. Yamcha follows up with his power, drops that anger to 0, and he gains an extra card in his hand. So Broly throws the Tandem Attack, draws the extra card, and this one swings for even more damage than the previous one. So this one actually goes through. That's going to hit for 12. In this case, it does a very similar amount of damage. You don't see a whole lot of endurance on Yamcha's end, which is really, really going to end up hurting him. The downside for Broly is that there are still the 2 blazes on the field, so Yamcha can get some extra cards back if he needs them. But to gain stage instead, he decides to throw the Tandem Blast, which Tandem Blast is free since Yamcha's on level 3. And he uses the de-leveling effect to go down to 2, get himself some extra stages, and since he knows that Broly has the Face Crusher in his hand, that's going to prevent him from using it for the 2nd time this game, which is a really, really big deal. But with so few cards in his deck, it may end up being too little too late. Broly decides to let the attack go through for 4, which is going to be a reasonable enough amount. And with so many cards in hand on both sides, it really could, end up stabilizing either way at this point. But Broly goes for the Mastery, and he decides to get a red high kick, which is on the top. He reveals the 4, and it's a complete whiff, which is not really what you want to see off of this card. As well as Broly's Face Crushers, they both do very similar things, but in this case, it's going to swing for the 5 stages and the 4 life, and you're going to see all the damage go through, and that's going to do it for the game. So Broly wins. Thank you guys so much for watching. I hope you guys enjoyed it. Like always, stay bad. We'll see you guys later.